Hi guys, welcome to our next lesson. So in October of 1929, we know the economy pretty much tanks in the United States. The stock market collapsed and things really aren't looking good. So how did the government respond to that? So stick around, obviously that's what we're going to be talking about today in class. So today we're going to be talking about responding to the crisis. What does the government do when things get bad? And we're going to try to answer the question, how did the government, including President Hoover, respond to the growing economic crisis at the end of the 1920s? So make sure you grab pencil, paper, open up some notes, get ready to take some notes, pay attention to the video, and hopefully by the end you'll be able to have a good answer to this question. So when everything went south with our economy back in 1929, President Hoover wound up taking a good majority of the blame for the whole thing. Remember that Hoover is a very much laissez-faire, hands-off kind of a president. He really didn't want to get the government involved. It really wasn't his fault, though. Even though he took a lot of the blame, it really wasn't his fault. Although many Americans really did blame him, though, for being out of touch. They thought he was out of touch with what Americans were asking for and with what Americans needed. President Hoover did respond with three things when the economy went south. Response number one was a concept that Hoover called rugged individualism. Basically, Herbert Hoover put it back on the American people. He told the American people that they're the ones that should be responsible for bettering themselves through their own efforts. In his view, it wasn't really the government's place to step in and try to help the people out, to help out him out. Because of this concept of rugged individualism, Hoover really refused to provide any kind of direct relief from the government. So basically, Hoover said he didn't want people to be dependent on the government for help every time something went wrong. The second big response that Hoover had to the crisis was a concept called volunteerism. Hoover said that the American people should rely on themselves to do the right thing. So he went around and asked businesses that were still operating to keep wages high and keep prices low and try to keep unemployment from getting any worse. Well, here's the problem with that. If businesses want to survive, there's no way they can keep wages high. There's no way they can keep prices where they're at. There's no way they can prevent any more unemployment. It's just the natural cycle of the economy. Hoover also asked a lot of wealthy people to give to charities. He said, it's not the government's place, but hey, Richie over there, rich guy, Richie, why don't you give a couple $1,000,000 to help these people out? Now think about all the things we've talked about with the wealthy class around this particular time frame. And remember the Gilded Age. Remember everything we talked about during the Progressive Era. How do you think that's going to go over just by asking rich people to help? Probably not too well, right? I doubt it's going to do much. And newsflash, it didn't. It didn't help. The third big response that Hoover had to this crisis took a little time to develop. Eventually, Hoover realized that the government's gonna have to do something. So he and some of his advisors cook up this idea for a public works project. If we can get the government to build something, we can put some people to work. That's like the whole logic behind it. And this is where the Hoover Dam comes into place. The Hoover Dam was meant to be a big, giant public works project, and it was meant to provide almost 5,000 people jobs. And it did. Well, here's the problem. When they started to put out a call for workers, 40,000 people showed up. They only needed 5,000. When you have that much unemployment, 40,000 people looking for 5,000 job slots, that's barely going to scratch the surface, right? Now, there was some upside to the Hoover Dam. It did put 5,000 people to work, and I'm sure those people, they were very grateful for that opportunity. When it was completed, it did also provide a lot of water and electricity for the West, which is something that area of the country genuinely needed. There's a big argument to be made that when you had cheap electricity and lots of available water in the area, that would also help to create more jobs. But in the grand scheme of things, this one public works project wasn't even enough to start. It couldn't even start to help solve the problem, right? As I'd mentioned before, Hoover did take a lot of blame for what was happening with the economy. Again, not really his fault, but he's the one that people started to blame. Other government officials tried to help out as well, not just Hoover. One of the most prominent government responses to the crisis was a thing called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act. This comes around in 1930. Basically, this act raised taxes on foreign goods. It significantly raised taxes on foreign-made goods. And this put the tariffs on those goods at the highest they'd ever been on imported goods. And the idea behind this was that if we make imported goods from other countries, so much more expensive, then people, the American people, will buy nothing but domestically American produced stuff, American produced products. And that'll help get the American economy going, because that will mean people will be working at American factories, things that are made at those factories will get bought, and so on and so forth. But here's the problem. When you jack up tariffs that high on foreign goods, how do you think other countries are going to respond to that? Are they just going to say, okay, no problem, we'll just deal with it? No. Well, this act basically destroyed any kind of international trade that the United States had going on with the rest of the world. Most places like Europe responded with passing tariffs of their own, which made US produced goods outrageously expensive. So this actually made the situation a lot worse. In fact, it made the global economic situation worse. A lot of people don't realize that during the Great Depression, it wasn't just the United States that was suffering. The depression was a global thing. The entire planet was suffering from an economic depression. And this tariff act, the Hoover-Smalley Tariff Act, basically just knocked everything down an extra notch and made it even worse. And two other bits of legislation that get passed right around the same time to try to help things out were the Federal Home Loan Bank Act and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation Act. Both of these were government responses to what was happening with the economy. Both had great intentions, but as you'll see here in just a second, both had some serious flaws. So let's take a look at the Federal Home Loan Bank Act first. The idea of this law was to lower mortgage rates across the board. This would allow farmers to refinance their loans. So mortgage loans are loans that they owned on land, on houses, right? So this law would let them refinance those loans and their houses to lower interest rates and try to avoid foreclosure and being kicked off their land, right? But here's the problem. We've talked about the Dust Bowl already. Were farmers able to produce on the land that they had during this time? No. Remember, there's a natural disaster going on that really prevented a lot of farmers from being able to do that. Yeah, it was nice that they lowered mortgage rates in this law, but when you don't have any money to pay, period, because you're not able to grow crops, a lower mortgage rate really isn't going to help you out much, right? The other major piece of legislation that got passed was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation Act. Basically, this was the government authorizing $2 million to be distributed for this emergency financing of big business. The idea was if we kept the big businesses like the banks, the railroads, those kinds of things open, this would help drive the economy and we could get back on track. So essentially what this law did is the government gave $2 million to the richest people in the United States. Were the richest people in the United States suffering? No. It was the middle and lower income classes that were having some serious problems. So this really didn't do much of anything to alleviate the majority of Americans suffering during the Great Depression. All this did was make the rich people just a little bit richer. And I really only have two takeaways from this part of the video for you. Number one is remember Hoover's response. You've got rugged individualism, volunteerism, and public works projects. The second takeaway is the government's response. Remember the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So next we're going to talk about life during the Great Depression. By the early 1930s, America's economy is pretty much in the toilet. We've sunk into a pretty bad economic depression. How did this affect Americans' lives? So next we're going to talk about life, like I said, during the Great Depression. Specifically, we're going to try to answer the question, what was life like for Americans during the Great Depression? And it seems like a pretty easy, simple question to answer. So grab some notes, make sure you're taking notes. Hopefully by the end of the video, you'll be able to have an answer to this question. So let's start off by taking a look at what life was like for people in rural areas of the country. So in rural areas, things didn't really change a whole lot for them. Most people in rural areas of the country were poor before the Depression hit. And guess what? They were poor during the Depression as well. It wasn't really a big change for a lot of these people. There were some farmers that were affected a little bit more than others. We've talked about the Dust Bowl before, especially that area of the Great Plains. They were really hit pretty hard. Somewhere around 400,000 farms wind up being foreclosed on during the Depression. A lot of farmers in this situation turned back to tenant farming. If you don't remember, we talked about that during our Reconstruction lesson, because remember from that lesson how well tenant farming worked? It didn't really work. Didn't work too well at all. And as I just mentioned, people living out in the Dust Bowl area were probably the hardest hit. Of those, the people living in the state of Oklahoma took a brunt of that natural disaster. A good number of farmers from that area in Oklahoma decided, they weren't going to stick around anymore for this. So about 300,000 farmers from Oklahoma started a westward migration to what they called the land of milk and honey. And a lot of them saw California and the West Coast as their salvation. Farmers and their families in this situation became known as Okies because of where they're from, Oklahoma. And a lot of these people wind up becoming migrant farmers. They would start in the southern part of the West Coast and kind of work their way up north, migrating with the seasons. Life in urban areas during the Depression was a totally different story, though. During the 1920s, a lot of the urban areas saw a lot of prosperity. So when the Depression hit, it hit them pretty hard. Remember that unemployment was around 25%. So 1 out of every 4 people didn't have a job. And remember what we said about having a job and being in the cities. If you don't have a job in the city, you don't have a way of surviving, really. On top of that, those people that did have jobs took a big hit as well. A lot of wages got cut in order for businesses to survive. A lot of hours also got cut. So you still may have a great, hourly wage, but if you're only working 2 or 3 hours a day, that's really not going to cut it, right? A lot of banks foreclosed on homes, which left a lot of people homeless. You'd also started to see a lot of bread lines and soup kitchens start to form in cities. There were some people that had some stuff during the Depression, and they chose to try to help out those that were in need that didn't. And this is where bread lines and soup kitchens come into play. So this photo here is a photo of a bread line here. And it's going to kind of kick off. I'm going to have a little depressing photo montage here. So if you want, I would pause, take a look at some of these photos. So you can see here, they're waiting for a soup kitchen. It says coffee and donuts for the unemployed, free soup. You can see here more soup lines, bread lines, people waiting. So some people were charitable. They were helping out as best they could. But clearly, some people they'd rather have a job, right, than waiting in line for some scraps of food. You can see this guy here. He's shaving with a fire hydrant, water from a fire hydrant. This is what a shanty town would have looked like. You can see the conditions that they were living in. Not the best. It actually looks worse than a lot of the tenements that we were looking at during the Progressive era and the industrial era, right? Here's an ironic billboard, right? It says world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. Meanwhile, what do you see here? It's a line of people waiting for bread, right? They're waiting for some sort of help. So African Americans were also impacted greatly during the Depression. All groups of Americans were affected. Here it says jobless men keep going. We can't take care of our own. Chamber of Commerce, right? So they didn't want people to come to the city begging for food. They could barely take care of the people that were already there in that city or town. And here are 4 children for sale. Inquire within. So they were literally selling off their children because they could no longer care for them. And they were hoping that someone with the means to be able to provide could come along and buy them and keep them alive, because the parents just gave up. They didn't feel like they could be able to do that. So I'd mentioned in an earlier video that President Hoover really he took a lot of the heat for what was happening during the Depression. So people in the cities kind of took this to a new level in giving Hoover crap over what was going on. And three terms start to show up in the early parts of the Depression that really kind of emphasized how much people were not happy with President Hoover. The first being the term Hooverville. So a Hooverville is basically just a homeless camp where people have kind of banded together to try to survive. Okay, it kind of looked like this camp back here in that other picture, this one right here. That's what the conditions of the Hoovervilles kind of look like. So you saw Hoovervilles pop up everywhere in every major city. Anywhere there's a big public space where they could basically set up a tent city or a shanty town built out of scraps that could be found. That was a Hooverville. Another term was the Hoover blanket. A lot of people were left with absolutely nothing during the Depression. A Hoover blanket was just an old newspaper that people used to try to keep themselves warm. So you may have seen an old cartoon or something with a bum or a hobo sleeping on a park bench covered in newspapers. Well, it turns out that that's actually a very real thing that happened during the Depression. Those newspapers were about the best blankets that they could come up with, and those were called Hoover blankets. The last term was called a Hoover flag, and this is something that people did to really show that they had hit rock bottom. So if you had absolutely nothing, you would reach in and you would turn your pockets inside out from your jeans, your pants, right? This represented how broke you really were. When you hit rock bottom and had absolutely nothing left, you flew your Hoover flag. And people would recognize this, and if they had a little bit, they'd try to share with you. But, that's nothing you could really count on during the Great Depression. Very few people had a lot during this time to share. This depression had a huge psychological toll on America. Nearly 2 million men left their families and homes to try to find work. You saw homes and families being broken apart. Millions of children were forced to quit school. A lot of them even ran away or were sold, like you saw in that other picture. A lot of them ran away from home because they didn't want to be a burden on their parents. A lot of people in our country flat out just lost the will to live. We saw the suicide rates in our country rise by almost 30% during the Great Depression. And we can't really talk much about the Great Depression, about the 1930s and the Great Depression without mentioning hobos. So this goes back to that psychological toll the Depression had on people. Roughly about 300,000 people, mostly men, but not exclusively men, some children and women, turned into hobos. A hobo is just a person that literally just wanders around because they have nothing better to do. They don't have a place to stay. They don't have a job they have to do, right? So about 300,000 people turned to this life of just wandering around the country. They would take advantage of people's generosity when they could. They would come up with other ways to survive if they had to. Most of them got around by doing what was known as riding the rails. So they would jump up on a train, they jump up on top of a train, and this is how they would get around the country. The problem is that was kind of a dangerous thing to do because it's very easy, especially when it started to get colder, especially if it was bad weather, right, and raining, for example, to slip off one of those railroad cars. There were about 25,000 recorded deaths on railroad property during the Great Depression. And these are just the people that we know of that died on trains by being hobos. Just think about how many thousands we probably didn't know about that weren't recorded. There's one incident that a lot of historians kind of refer to as the rock bottom for America during the Depression that we need to talk about. And it's called the Bonus Army. So during World War I, anybody who served overseas when the war was over was promised a bonus. They were promised $1 a day for every day that they were not in the United States. Well, these veterans never saw their bonus. It kept being put off and put off and put off. And eventually they got tired and they started to march towards Washington, D.C. to demand that they get that bonus that they were promised. A huge Hooverville, as you can see on the right here, was set up right in the smack dab heart of Washington, D.C. And the Bonus Army, these veterans that were promised this a little bit extra for serving, This bonus army refused to leave until they got the money that they deserved and, quite frankly, really needed. As you can imagine, having a group of homeless veterans camped out right in front of your capital doesn't really make America look like the best place. And so President Hoover actually ordered the removal of this bonus army. And he tasked a guy named General Douglas MacArthur, who you will learn about in World War II, and he tasked him with getting rid of them. Well, the way MacArthur did this was through tear gas and bayonets. Basically, they threw a bunch of tear gas into the Hooverville and charged in with bayonets, not necessarily intentionally trying to hurt anybody, but trying to scare them off. Unfortunately, in this removal attempt, a baby wound up getting killed and a child wound up becoming blind because of the tear gas that was used. And this obviously really didn't sit well with the American people. It really didn't make America in general look really good, and it kind of signaled the end for Herbert Hoover. After this incident, after word got out that Hoover was the one that ordered the removal, his reputation and his political career was pretty much ruined at that point. This signaled for America that it was time for a serious change. So I really only have two takeaways for you from this part of the video. Number one, remember that rural life was pretty depressing because of the Dust Bowl. Takeaway number two is that urban life was really depressing because of high unemployment. So there you go, guys. Life during the Depression. So hopefully you got great notes. Hopefully you'll be ready for the final. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll be sure to try to help you out.